Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and once again, another overly sarcastic productions reaction. Man, they're just pumping them out recently. But yes, this time we're not going back with Red, talking about like stories and tropes and stuff like that. No, we're going back to Blue with History Summarized, the Ancient Greek Post-Apocalypse. So, yeah, which Greeks does he mean by that? When he says ancient Greeks, that almost makes me think of like the Mycenaean. Is that? Oh god, I'm forgetting what it is now. I'm having a brain fart. The Mycenaean Greeks, which were the Greeks that came before the classical Greeks, during the Bronze Age. What was I don't know. I've been on a bit of a Bronze Age kick recently with a channel called Dan Davis History. I've known that like the Bronze Age was very centered around trade. Like I've known that like food trade from Egypt and like tin being brought down from like England and stuff like that were like major things in the Bronze Age. But again, I'm going into all of this, and I haven't even started the video, and I don't even know if those are the Greeks that he's talking about. So, before I start rattling on and add like 10 minutes to the beginning of this video for no real reason, let's actually get to let's actually get to the video itself, shall we?
What does it look like when a civilization collapses? For my part, I hope to never know from experience, but we can indulge this morbid curiosity by looking into ancient history, where few societies imploded quite so spectacularly as the Mycenaean
I was right,
world
Bronze
of the
Age!
Greek Bronze Age. Yet even if we presume that mega-scale piracy and a war in Troy figured into it somehow...
Actually, wait a second, there is one thing I remember, just for like context, the Mycenaean, whatever he said, because again, I'm having a complete brain fart on how do you actually pronounce it. The Mycenaean Greeks were to the ancient Greeks what the ancient Greeks were to us. Just to get you like that, like time scale wise.
The process of collapse for Greece's interconnected palace ecosystem is clouded in the smoke and rubble of its own downfall. Still, in the end, it sure as hell broke. Palaces lay abandoned, trade had evaporated, the population shrank, writing was forgotten, and it took nearly half a millennium before the Greeks re-emerged from the ensuing Dark Age. Now, that's a bit of a dodgy term, and historians will die for their terminology, so while the modern interpretation emphasizes the loss of writing as the darkness rather than making any value judgment, we can better understand this point in history not as the absence of something, but as the drafting table for what will become the most fundamental concepts of Greek civilization going forward. To see how, let's do some history. By the traditional reckoning, the stone-built citadel of Mycenae falls in 1177 BC, and within a century and change, all but 40 of the 300-plus settlements across Greece fall off the map, while the use of bronze for tools and finery likewise disappears. The island of Crete and the Mycenaean heartland of the Peloponnese had none of the worst, and with...
Actually, what was the whole thing? I need to look up, like, Bronze Age tin deposits. Yeah, so if you look at this, it's kind of funny. Tin was mostly found everywhere except where the main area of the Bronze Age actually took place, which is kind of funny when you think about it. I know copper was a lot more plentiful, but again, tin. It's
With pirates just off the coast, no city walls for protection, and no economy to support dense urban settlement, the survivors of the collapse went to the safest logical space: away. So while the urban population utterly collapses down to less than a tenth, the overall populace had only halved. Yet, for those survivors, we can imagine their feelings by picturing the view from down the hills and reflecting on the once magnificent palaces of their ancestors lying empty as a shell. It's not just that life was hard, it used to be better. The greatest Mycenaean citadel suffered the hardest of falls, and many would never be inhabited again, but the periphery up north had a softer landing. The hilltop citadel on the Attica Peninsula might never have been abandoned and would remain in use as it became the Athenian Acropolis. Plot twist.
Okay.
Further out on the island of Evia, we find the rare site of...
Again, it's that whole thing with ancient cities being built on top of ancient cities. When they discovered the actual city of Troy, or what we think is the actual city of Troy, they thought it's like, oh, it could be here, and they went straight to, and the guy, I'm forgetting who he was now, but he thought, oh, Troy should be the oldest city, so he literally used dynamite to blow up everything in the way. Turns out, Troy was several layers up from the very oldest settlement. And there were still layers of settlement on top of it.
New stone construction, a small palace-like estate with the remains of a cremated king, his wife, and horses seemingly done to emulate the heroic burials recounted in the Trojan War. Surprisingly, this grave does hold some bronze work, but it's vastly outnumbered by goods made of iron. And this illustrates one of the period's big riddles. How did the Bronze Age upgrade to the Iron Age if all of civilization went kaplooey? It seems incongruous, but it made perfect sense to the Greeks because, to them, iron was a downgrade, merely a product of cruel necessity. The two chemical components for bronze were mostly sourced outside of the Aegean, with copper from Cyprus and tin as far as England. But
so wait, iron as a downgrade? Well, I need to look this up. Is bronze harder than like raw iron? What's going on here? Bronze is corrosion resistant. Okay, because it rusts on the surface, offers less friction than iron. And is easier to work with. However, bronze is heavier than iron, difficult to make. Yeah, so I can definitely see why those two things would make bronze a better thing. And also, I would also see it as, copper and tin, as I said, it's harder to work with, but it's a lot easier to refine, just for the basic fact that you don't have to get copper or tin as insanely hot as iron for it to turn molten. Well, I guess they wouldn't turn it, would they turn it molten, or okay, I'm trying to remember how, Primitive Technologies has done iron refining on his YouTube channel. Oh god, I'm going at a complete ancient kick here. But yeah, I can see some of the reasons why iron would be considered a downgrade.
But when the trade routes dried up after the collapse, bronze making got way the hell harder. However, iron ore was naturally occurring beneath most of mainland Greece. The technique came from Cyprus and was likely introduced in the 1000s BC at bustling spots like Lefkandi, but it soon became widespread. We can appreciate that iron's a harder material, but the Greeks thought it was too much of a pain in the ass to smelt for how much uglier it was than bronze.
Yeah.
To be fair, correct. Contrary to our darling March of Progress, the 8th century poet Hesiod coined the entire concept of the Iron Age to bitterly lament the decline from the heroic glories of bronze to the backbreaking labor that iron represents. But even if iron was a scrub metal for idiot losers,
I've never thought of it that way. Of course, it may be better in some instances, but you have to work so much harder to work with it. And it's just not as pretty. Yeah, I guess that does. Actually, it doesn't. That does remind me. What is it? The physicist who came up with Schrödinger. That's it. Schrödinger's cat. The whole thing, but the cat being locked inside a box that has a vial of poison that could break at any minute. So until you actually open the box to look inside, the cat can be both considered alive and dead. Schrödinger said that to make fun of quantum physics, but then it eventually went on to become how you just basically explain quantum physics. It's that whole thing. I don't know if there's an actual term for that, process. Again, I'm getting extremely sidetracked here. I'm very sorry.
Its prevalence does show us that Greeks were slowly coalescing into large enough groups to mine, smelt, and make use of the stuff. In the immediate wake of the fall, the basic group unit was the oikos, a family with the head of household, immediate relatives, slaves, and any retainers who attached themselves to the oikos for protection. A far cry from Mycenaean royalties, but it was fit for purpose. Over the centuries, they grew into villages, then towns, and by the 8 to 700s, cities. And it's here that we can finally speak of the polis.
And that's once you get big enough populations and big enough manpower, that's when you can, start having people do the backbreaking labor of mining iron.
An urban center surrounded by supportive farmland and dozens of smaller villages, which will become the definitive unit of Greek society.
And this is not the ancient, but classical Greece. I'm guessing this is where all the fact that the majority of classical Greece, it was just nothing but city-states.
We translate the concept as a city-state, but it's the combination of city and land that creates 1,000 self-sufficient polis across Greece. Your Spartas, your Athenses, and countless others whose arrival marks the turn from the Dark Age into the Polis Age, where Greece as we recognize it comes into form. However, I'm getting ahead of myself because this shift took hundreds of years, and that notable slowness owed in part to how hard Greece can actually be to live in. Every tiny valley beneath the mountains could accommodate some hurts people, but larger communities may rapidly find themselves outstripping what that land provides. This started causing trouble around the 800s, so the Greeks employed 3 new strategies. First was to conquer your neighbors by force and take their land. That'll be Sparta's MO. Second was to trade with those new Phoenician merchants to sell what you have and buy what you need. That's the Athens strat. And third was to send some of your people out to make a new town on some distant coastal island and collaborate at a distance. This was originally the Evia strategy, but it'd soon be an everyone strategy. And all this movement brought the Greeks into closer and more frequent contact with those seafaring Phoenicians. Merchants though they were, their biggest gift to Greek civilization was not goods, but writing. Because some curious Greek in the late 800s saw a Phoenician marking down trade logs and figured they could use those same characters to write Greek. Of course, the languages aren't one-to-one, so the big swerve was taking the Phoenician characters Greek didn't have sounds for and instead making them represent vowels. Now, this easy list of 20-odd shapes could convey everything imaginable with no ambiguity and let ideas traverse both distance and time. The uses were immediately apparent, not just for ledgers, laws, and inscriptions, but poetry. And from the very first scraps of text, it all seems like the #1 poetic focus was the Trojan War.
I am the cup of nectar's country. A desire for beautification towards Aphrodite will seize him instantly.
As it was possibly the single biggest event in Mycenaean history. That said, it's pretty damn impressive that Polis-era Greeks even knew it had happened. For those stories to survive the loss of writing and the aforementioned total destruction of urban society, etc., the original tales from Bronze Age poets needed to pass through an unbroken oral tradition, dispersed across the Aegean and preserved through generations of families in quotes, fragments, and episodes. No small task. That storytelling chain inspired the heroic burial at Lefkandi and survived until long-distance trade re-emerged, letting storytellers start comparing notes. The tale of the Trojan War was far too vast for one poet to recount in a night, so the Greeks told it in a series of episodes within a broader epic cycle. So, with the advent of writing, it became possible to take several smaller stories, dozens
them
even,
all together,
and codify them into one cohesive megawork, or in this case, 2, because the late 8th century graces us with the Iliad and the Odyssey. We ascribe these to the legendary poet Homer, but whomever he may have been, the stories as we have them are the product of thousands of oral storytellers.
Just thousands of Homers
over hundreds of years. And you can hear that pan-Hellenic collaboration in the poems, combining elements from every Greek dialect and simultaneously including details only a Polis Age poet would have seen with things only a Bronze Age story could remember. Spooky. Both stories at once show the harshness of war and piracy as well as the glories of the heroic past, and that perspective really only makes sense coming from a small family looking down on a hill onto that broken palace of their ancestors. The subtle yet pervasive melancholy of these poems is the voice of every Dark Age poet that carried that story from Mycenae to Homer. And if we are to speak of a single poet, Homer, his great innovation was combining the episodes into character dramas for Achilles and Odysseus. All the mythological embellishments prevented from serving as any strict chronicle, but the values and deeds of the epic heroes become guiding moral principles for a shared Greek identity. The epics aren't a sacred text, but rather the main ideological statements of what Greeks should be. And on a meta level, they define this new society. If you can read the epics in Greek, then you are Greek. So by the 700s, Greeks have local political unity within the polis and a broader cultural unity through language and the epics. And this spirit of communal individuality drives the Greek love of competition, flexing your excellence in pursuit of glory, and that heroic swagger manifests in athletic competition. In 776 BC, the sanctuary of Zeus at Olympia hosts the very first Olympic Games. And in true heroic style, Olympic victors would be immortalized in poetry. It's all the spirit of epic heroism. So as we enter the Polis Age, we see some elements of continuity back from the Bronze Age. The spoken Greek language, the pantheon of gods, memories of Troy on fire. But in the time between the loss and rediscovery of writing, Greece was transforming into a land of city-states, all inspired by the heroic glories in their shared epics. Gotta say, composing the core essence of all Greek civilization is not bad for a Dark Age. Now go read the Iliad. Thank you for watching. Greek history is just such a joy for me that it is a miracle I'm able to make videos on literally anything else. In that vein, I'd like to thank our patrons here for subsidizing my Hellenic hyperfixation, and I will see you all in the next video.
Again, just going back to the Iliad, it's just, I mean, the story was kept alive for hundreds and hundreds of years purely through word of mouth. Wait a second. How long was it for until the Bible was written down? 40 years. The first versions of the Bible, like the first books before, this was before they were codified into the, you know, the one Bible that, well, one quote unquote, the one Bible that we had. It was only 40 years after Jesus' death, or, you know, supposed death, depending on like when you see years and stuff like that, you know, that semantics, as opposed to the Greek Iliad, which had to survive literally hundreds of years before it was finally written down. I mean, just stuff like that. They say that there was a point in history where recording history changed from like telling stories to actually telling what happened in history. And I can't help but feel the whole thing about like having telling history as like a story, like the Iliad and stuff like that, might have been just a side product of making the story easier to remember so that people could pass it on, versus, you know, just a like one step after the other, like historical like timeline. Gotta love it. People are. So with that out of the way, the original, as always, is linked in the description. As I said before, I've been on sort of a Bronze Age kick recently, and I've been watching a lot of videos from a channel called Dan Davis History. I don't think I'm going to do reaction to them, basically because they're very much a lot more like documentary style, and it would be most likely a lot of me just staring at the screen, sort of like just, you know, taking it in. So I don't think that's really that fun to watch. So either way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if you have not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.